powerful nobles in Europe, bishops in their finest robes, all gathered for a king's funeral. Everything is prepared. Prayers are ready. The stone tomb sits open before the altar. They lift the coffin of William the Conqueror, the man who invaded England and bent an entire nation to his will. They begin to place his body into the sarcophagus when suddenly, a sound like tearing fabric fills the sacred space. The king's bloated abdomen explodes. Rotted flesh bursts from the corpse. A wave of putrid stench so overwhelming, so absolutely vile erupts into the church that grown men, warriors who had seen battlefields soaked in blood, begin vomiting uncontrollably. Bishops flee, their robes flying behind them. Nobles shove each other aside, desperate to escape. Within seconds, the carefully planned royal funeral dissolves into absolute chaos. This was the final moment of William the Conqueror. But this nightmare didn't begin at his funeral. It began 6 weeks earlier, and what happened to this king's body during those weeks was so horrifying that even medieval chroniclers, men who lived in an age of public executions and brutal warfare, struggled to find words adequate to describe it. William the Conqueror had died once, but his body had been dying twice. First, from the inside out while he was still conscious, still breathing, still able to feel every moment of his own flesh rotting away from his bones. It was July 1087, and William wasn't supposed to be dying, he was supposed to be conquering. At 59 years old, he was leading yet another military campaign, this time against the French town of Mantes. Why? Because King Philip of France had mocked him, had called him fat, had compared the aging conqueror to a pregnant woman. That insult cut deeper than any sword ever could. William's entire life had been defined by proving himself. Born illegitimate, mocked as William the Bastard throughout his childhood, he had clawed his way to power through sheer violence and will. He had taken Normandy by force, invaded England, crushed every rebellion, built an empire on the bodies of his enemies. And now some French king dared mock his weight. Mantes would burn. William would make sure of that. The siege was proceeding exactly as planned. The town was surrounded. Buildings erupted into flames. The screams of people trapped inside their burning homes filled the air. Smoke billowed into the summer sky, thick and black. William rode through the streets on his massive warhorse, surveying the destruction with satisfaction. For a man who had spent his life conquering, this was just another victory, another message sent to anyone who dared disrespect him. But then his horse reared. Some chroniclers say it stepped on hot embers fallen from a collapsing building. Others claim it was startled by a sudden crash nearby. The reason doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. The powerful destrier lurched forward violently, and William's enormous body was thrown hard against the iron pommel of his saddle. That metal horn drove deep into his swollen belly. He felt something tear inside him. Not on the surface. Deep within his abdomen. Something fundamental. Something catastrophic. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like nothing he had ever experienced in decades of warfare. William nearly fell from his horse. His attendants rushed to him, seeing their king doubled over, gasping, his hands clutching his stomach. They examined him quickly, looking for wounds, for blood, but there was nothing visible. No cut. No puncture. Nothing to explain why their king was suddenly pale and sweating, why his eyes had gone wide with shock. The royal physicians were summoned immediately, but these men, despite their education and experience, were operating with medieval knowledge. They couldn't see inside William's body. They couldn't understand that the impact had ruptured his intestines, torn internal organs, and unleashed something far deadlier than any weapon on a battlefield. Bacteria. Billions upon billions of bacteria, that normally lived harmlessly in his gut, were now flooding into his abdominal cavity, an environment where they absolutely should not be. William refused to show weakness. Even in agony, even knowing something was terribly wrong, he ordered his men to transport him back to Rouen, to the priory of Saint Gervais, where he could recover in privacy. That journey was torture. Every movement of the litter that carried him sent waves of pain through his body. By the time they reached Rouen, William was burning with fever, delirious, his massive body already beginning its transformation into something monstrous. His physicians tried everything medieval medicine could offer. They bled him repeatedly, believing bad humors needed to be released. They applied poultices made from herbs and animal fat. They gave him concoctions meant to balance his bodily fluids. They prayed. Nothing worked. Because while they treated him with leeches and prayers, inside William's body, a war was being lost at the cellular level. The ruptured intestines had released digestive enzymes and fecal bacteria into his peritoneal cavity. Peritonitis set in, causing his abdominal lining to become inflamed and infected. His immune system fought desperately, but in 1087, without antibiotics, this was a battle that could not be won. The infection spread rapidly through his organs. His liver, his spleen, his kidneys all began to fail. Blood flow to his intestines decreased, and tissue started dying. Gangrene took hold, both the wet gangrene where tissue rots from infection and gas gangrene, where bacteria produce bubbles of methane and hydrogen sulfide within the flesh itself. Within days of the accident, the true horror became visible. William's abdomen began to swell, not like normal swelling from injury. This was grotesque, unnatural. His belly distended like it was being inflated from inside, stretching the skin tight and shiny. The flesh changed color, first red, then purple, then patches of black where the tissue underneath had completely died. But the worst symptom, the one that would define his final weeks, was the smell. The odor emanating from William's body wasn't like anything his attendants had encountered before. It was the smell of death, but death that had arrived too early, claiming its victim piece by piece while he still lived. It was the smell of necrotic tissue decomposing, of gas gangrene releasing sulfur compounds, of bacteria breaking down protein and fat into putrescine and cadaverine, the chemicals literally named for their association with corpses. That smell filled William's chamber, seeped into the corridors, pervaded the entire wing of the monastery. Servants who were assigned to care for the king would enter his room, and immediately begin gagging. They held cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs over their faces, but nothing could mask that overwhelming reek of putrefaction. Some would retch. Others would vomit, and increasingly, they simply refused to enter at all. William was conscious through all of this. That's what made it so much worse than simply dying. He could feel his body rotting. He could smell his own decay. The pain was constant, unbearable. Medieval chroniclers, who were not prone to exaggeration about such matters, recorded that his screams could be heard throughout the monastery. He begged for death, pleaded for release from the agony. But death was taking its time with William the Conqueror. His skin turned grayish, the color of spoiled meat. His face, once full and ruddy, became gaunt and hollow. His eyes sank deep into their sockets. Dark patches appeared where the flesh beneath was dying. He was literally rotting alive, his body consuming itself, while he remained horribly, cruelly conscious. For a man who had built his entire identity on physical power, on the ability to dominate through force and will, this was psychological torture as profound as the physical agony. William had never been helpless in his life. Born as an illegitimate son, he had fought from childhood to claim power. His enemies had mocked him as William the Bastard, and he had answered with violence. At 24, he had secured Normandy through a series of brutal battles. At 38, he had done what no one thought possible: invaded England, defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and claimed the English throne. He had crushed rebellions with such ferocity that entire regions still trembled at his name. The harrying of the North in 1069 had been systematic destruction on a massive scale. For months, Norman soldiers burned crops, slaughtered livestock, destroyed farming tools, and killed anyone who resisted. The resulting famine killed an estimated 100,000 people. William had ordered this. He had watched it happen without flinching. This was a man who conquered through fear, who bent entire populations to his will through sheer brutal force. And now, at the end, that will was completely powerless. He couldn't fight the bacteria with a sword. He couldn't intimidate the infection with his reputation. He couldn't overcome gangrene with courage or strategy. The conqueror was being conquered by enemies he couldn't even see, by processes he couldn't understand, by his own body turning against him. In his lucid moments, he reportedly wept, not just from pain, but from the bitter understanding of his absolute helplessness. And then, as if his suffering wasn't enough, betrayal arrived. As William's condition worsened, and the smell became truly unbearable, his most trusted servants began to abandon him. These were men who had served him for years, who had sworn loyalty, who had benefited from his reign. But duty and loyalty couldn't overcome basic human revulsion. Attendants would enter his chamber to bring food or change bedding, but they would flee within minutes, unable to bear the stench. Some claimed they would rather face punishment than endure another moment in that room. The king, who had commanded absolute loyalty from thousands, now found himself increasingly alone. But abandonment was only the beginning. As word spread through the monastery and into the surrounding area that William was dying, something even more disgusting than his physical decay began to happen. Opportunists started circling like vultures. William's chamber didn't just contain his rotting body. It also contained his possessions, the treasures accumulated over a lifetime of conquest. Gold chains, jeweled daggers, fine silks, precious artifacts, chests full of coins. These represented enormous wealth, and as William lay dying and defenseless, hands began reaching for them. At first, it was small items. A gold bracelet disappeared from a table, a silver cup vanished. Then, when no consequences followed, the theft became brazen. Servants, guards, even some nobles who had come to pay their respects began looting the dying king's chamber. They would cover their faces against the unbearable stench, rush in, grab whatever valuables they could carry, and flee with their spoils. William was aware of what was happening. In his moments of consciousness, he could see figures moving through his room, taking his things, and he was too weak to stop them. Too weak even to call out. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote about this with horror, describing how men who had once knelt before William in fear now stepped over his rotting body to steal from him. Some reportedly laughed as they divided their loot, joking about the great conqueror's helplessness. It was degradation beyond imagination. The man who had terrorized England into submission, who had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands, who had ruled through fear and iron will, was now the victim of petty theft, and couldn't defend even his personal belongings. Throughout this nightmare, William sought spiritual comfort. Despite his brutal career, or perhaps because of it, he had always been devout. He had built churches, endowed monasteries, sought the church's blessing for his conquest. Now facing death, he desperately wanted absolution for his sins. Priests attended him, hearing his confessions, administering last rites. But even these holy men struggled to remain in his chamber for long. They would rush through prayers, bless the king hastily, and retreat, gasping for fresh air. In his confessions, William acknowledged the violence of his reign. He admitted to the deaths of countless thousands, to the destruction of villages and towns, to the cruel suppression of rebellions. He particularly lamented the harrying of the North, that campaign of systematic destruction that had killed so many. He confessed his treatment of his eldest son, Robert, their fraught relationship marked by rebellion and conflict. He made arrangements for his succession, designating Robert to inherit Normandy while his second son, William Rufus, would take England. His third son, Henry, would receive only money, a decision that would lead to years of fraternal warfare. As July turned to August, William's body continued its grotesque transformation. The swelling in his abdomen grew worse, his belly distending to an enormous size. The skin stretched so tight it became translucent in places, revealing the horror beneath. The discoloration deepened, patches of black spreading across his torso. The smell intensified to the point where people in the monastery's courtyard could detect it. Birds reportedly avoided flying over that section of the building. The very air seemed poisoned. On September 9, 1087, William the Conqueror finally died. According to witnesses, his death came at dawn as the bells of Rouen cathedral rang for morning prayers. The sound apparently stirred him to consciousness one final time. He attempted to raise his hands in prayer, mumbled something about commending his soul to the Virgin Mary, and then his breathing stopped. After weeks of agony, after rotting alive while fully conscious, death came almost peacefully. But the horror wasn't over. The moment William died, the last of his attendants fled. They abandoned his body immediately, leaving it alone in that stinking chamber, surrounded by the possessions that hadn't yet been stolen. For hours, possibly for most of the day, the corpse lay unattended in the late summer heat. The bacteria that had killed him continued their work with renewed vigor now that his immune system had shut down completely. The body that had been decomposing while he lived now began decomposing in earnest. The problem facing those responsible for William's funeral was unprecedented. They had the body of a king, which demanded royal honors and ceremony, but that body was so decomposed and malodorous that no one wanted to approach it. The embalmers who were summoned took one smell and refused the task. Eventually, a local knight named Herluin agreed to organize the funeral in exchange for substantial payment. It was a job no one else would accept. Herluin arranged for the body to be roughly prepared and placed in a lead-lined coffin designed to contain the smell. Even this process was nightmarish. Those who had to touch the corpse reported that the flesh was soft and yielding, that pieces came away in their hands. The body was wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in wine and spices, but nothing could truly contain that stench. The coffin was sealed as quickly as possible, and the funeral procession set out from Rouen to Caen, where William had requested burial, at the Abbey of Saint Etienne. The journey was supposed to be a solemn tribute to the great conqueror. Instead, it became a race against decomposition. The sealed coffin was loaded onto a wagon, but the smell leaked out anyway. As the procession moved through the Norman countryside, peasants and townspeople who had gathered to pay respects found themselves gagging and fleeing. Some chroniclers recorded that people threw flowers toward the procession, not as a sign of respect, but in a desperate attempt to counter the odor. Dogs that approached the funeral wagon would howl and run away. When the procession reached Caen, disaster struck. A fire had broken out in the town, possibly started accidentally, and the funeral party had to wait while it was extinguished. The coffin remained in the summer heat for additional hours. Inside that sealed lead container, the processes of decomposition accelerated dramatically. Gases built up within the bloated corpse. Pressure increased. By the time the funeral could finally proceed to the abbey church, the situation had become dangerous. The church of St. Etienne was crowded with nobles, bishops, and clergy who had gathered to honor the deceased king. Despite rumors about the condition of the body, protocol and respect for the throne demanded their presence. The church was decorated with appropriate solemnity. Incense burned. Prayers were prepared. The stone sarcophagus sat open and ready before the altar. Everything was arranged for a dignified royal funeral, but dignity was about to become impossible. The pallbearers carried the heavy lead coffin into the church and approached the sarcophagus. The first problem became immediately apparent. Despite the lead lining, a terrible smell was emanating from the coffin. As it was carried down the aisle, members of the congregation began to cough and cover their faces. Some of the assembled nobles and clergy backed away, but the ceremony had to continue. The coffin was placed beside the sarcophagus, and priests began the funeral rites. Then came the moment when William's body needed to be transferred from the coffin to the sarcophagus for final burial. The pallbearers opened the lead coffin, and the smell that had been partially contained was suddenly released in full force into the enclosed space of the church. The reaction was immediate and violent. People throughout the congregation began to retch. Some vomited. Others moved toward the doors. But the pallbearers, committed to completing their task, attempted to lift the body. This is when the ultimate horror occurred. William's corpse, swollen with the gases of decomposition, wrapped in cloth and armor, had to be maneuvered into the stone sarcophagus. But there was a catastrophic problem. The sarcophagus had been prepared years earlier, when William was younger and fitter. In his later years, he had become enormously obese. The bloating caused by decomposition had made his body even larger. When the pallbearers tried to force the corpse into the stone coffin, it wouldn't fit. They pushed harder, trying to compress the body into the space. The swollen abdomen pressed against the sides. More pressure was applied. And then, to the absolute horror of everyone present, William's body burst. The abdomen ruptured where it had been injured at Mantes, and the contents of the decomposed corpse erupted outward. Rotted flesh, liquefied organs, gases that had been building for weeks all exploded into the sacred space. The smell that had been unbearable before became absolutely apocalyptic. It was, chroniclers wrote, like the gates of hell had opened inside the church. Orderic Vitalis, describing the scene, wrote that the stench was so powerful it was almost visible, like a dark cloud filling the sanctuary. Nobles and bishops fled in panic, pushing past each other to reach the doors. Many were openly vomiting. Priests abandoned the ceremony mid-prayer, running from the altar. The carefully planned royal funeral descended into complete chaos. Even the most duty-bound attendants couldn't remain in the building. Within minutes, the church was nearly empty, except for a handful of clergy remaining at a distance, covering their faces with their vestments. The few who remained attempted desperately to salvage the situation. Massive amounts of incense were brought in and set burning throughout the church. Perfumes were sprinkled. The body was hastily shoved into the sarcophagus, though it still didn't fit properly. The decision was made to seal the tomb immediately rather than attempt any further ceremony. Stonemasons were called to seal the sarcophagus with mortar and stone slabs. Even these workers, accustomed to handling the dead, had to work in shifts, retreating regularly to breathe fresh air. The funeral was concluded in unseemly haste. Prayers were mumbled rapidly by priests, standing as far from the tomb as possible. No eulogies were delivered. No elaborate ceremony celebrated William's achievements. The man who had conquered England, who had ruled 2 kingdoms, who had been one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, was buried in chaos and disgrace. His funeral remembered not for honoring his legacy, but for the revolting spectacle of his bursting corpse. News of the horrific funeral spread rapidly throughout Norman and English territories. The story was too grotesque, too shocking not to share. Within weeks, everyone from nobles to peasants knew how the great conqueror's body had exploded in church, how assembled nobles had fled vomiting, how the burial had been conducted in panicked haste. For a society that placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites and dignity of the dead, William's end was seen as catastrophically shameful. But more than gossip, the story took on profound symbolic significance. Medieval people believed strongly in signs and divine judgment. Many interpreted William's gruesome death and burial as God's verdict on his life. He had lived by violence, conquering through brutality. He had ordered the deaths of thousands, destroyed communities, ruled through fear. Now in death, he had been denied even basic dignity. His body had betrayed him, falling apart before witnesses, unable even to remain intact for burial. The symbolism was especially potent because of the contrast between William's power in life and his helplessness in death. He had commanded armies, but his own body defeated him. He had accumulated vast wealth, but it was stolen as he died. He had inspired fear in thousands, but in the end inspired only revulsion. The man who had everything was reduced to nothing, to less than nothing, to a bursting corpse that couldn't even be buried without causing horror. Religious commentators seized on William's end as a lesson about pride and sin. Sermons were preached using his story as an example of how even the mightiest must humble themselves before God. The harrying of the North was specifically cited as a sin so great that even his pious donations couldn't atone for it. His violent suppression of resistance, his ruthless treatment of rebels, his iron rule, all were cited as reasons why God had allowed such a degrading death. The tomb itself became a site of mixed significance. St. Etienne Abbey housed the grave, and pilgrims did visit, but it never achieved the veneration typical of royal tombs. There was something too unsettling about William's burial. The story of the bursting corpse was too well known, too horrifying. Instead of inspiring devotion, the tomb inspired unease. Over the centuries, William's tomb suffered various indignities that echoed his burial. In 1522, during renovations, the tomb was opened and disturbed. In 1562, during the French Wars of Religion, Calvinist forces completely destroyed it. The bones were scattered, lost or destroyed. Only a single thigh bone was reportedly saved. When a new monument was erected in the 19th century, it contained only that single bone. The conqueror's final resting place is almost empty. The man who claimed so much territory has less than a complete skeleton to mark his grave. The medical reality of William's death can now be understood with modern knowledge, making it even more horrifying. The injury from the saddle pommel ruptured internal organs, probably his intestines and possibly his spleen or liver. This released intestinal bacteria into his abdominal cavity. Peritonitis developed rapidly. Without antibiotics, the infection spread through his organs. Gangrene followed, both gas gangrene producing bubbles within tissue, and wet gangrene where tissue dies and rots. William's obesity worked against him. More tissue meant more infection. Poor circulation allowed gangrene to spread. The abdominal fat provided an excellent environment for bacterial growth. When he died, gases produced by bacteria built up pressure inside his corpse, especially in the heat. The rupturing during the funeral was almost inevitable. Modern medicine would have saved William easily. Antibiotics would have stopped the infection. Surgery could have repaired injuries and cleaned infected tissue. But in 1087, internal injuries were death sentences. To rot while still alive, to feel one's own body decomposing, to smell the stench of your own decay, is horror beyond imagination. For William, whose life had been defined by physical prowess, control, and domination, the experience must have been psychologically devastating. He was forced to confront not just mortality, but helplessness. His body became his enemy in a way no external foe had ever been. The story endures because it touches fundamental fears about bodily betrayal. We can fight external enemies, but when our own flesh becomes the problem, there is nowhere to turn. William's death taps into primal fears that resonate across centuries. It's why chroniclers documented every detail, why historians retell it, why modern audiences remain fascinated. The grotesque details speak to something fundamental about human vulnerability. The story also serves as a stark reminder of the limits of power. William achieved what many thought impossible. He invaded England and made himself its king. He held that throne through political acumen and ruthless force. He reshaped English society, introducing Norman feudalism, conducting the Domesday Survey, building castles throughout the land. His impact was profound and lasting. The English language itself was permanently altered by his conquest. Yet all that power couldn't save William from a simple accident and bacterial infection. The armies he commanded couldn't fight microorganisms. The castles he built provided no defense against peritonitis. The fear he inspired was meaningless to the gangrene consuming his flesh. The conqueror was conquered by enemies he couldn't see. This contrast between worldly power and biological vulnerability has made his death a cautionary tale. Medieval people saw it as divine judgment. Modern audiences see it as a reminder of human fragility. Either interpretation recognizes the same truth. No amount of success, power, or achievement can ultimately protect us from our physical nature. The horror is compounded by the abandonment he suffered. In his time of greatest need, those he had ruled abandoned him. His servants fled. His possessions were stolen. His funeral became a disaster. There was a failure of basic human dignity in how he died and how he was buried. The theft of his possessions, while he lay dying, is particularly poignant. These weren't just valuable objects, but symbols of his life's work. Every piece of gold, every jewel represented a conquest, a victory. To have them stolen as he lay helpless must have been emotionally devastating, concrete demonstration that his power was already gone, that he was already irrelevant. The contrast with his funeral compounds this indignity. Royal funerals were supposed to be magnificent, celebrating the monarch's life and demonstrating continuity of power. William's achieved none of this. Instead of celebrating his legacy, it became a story of horror. Instead of demonstrating the dignity of the crown, it showed a corpse bursting before a fleeing congregation. Those who witnessed William's death and funeral were traumatized. Many had known him for years, had served in his armies, had benefited from his reign. To see such a powerful figure reduced to a rotting, stinking corpse was psychologically devastating. It would have shaken their understanding of power, authority, and their own mortality. The clergy struggled with theological questions. Why would God allow such suffering? Was this punishment? Could his confessions save his soul despite his degraded death? For common people who heard the story, William's death seemed like cosmic justice. He had ruled harshly. The harrying of the North alone killed tens of thousands. Rebellions were crushed with extreme violence. Heavy taxes impoverished many. To hear that such a fearsome king had died in agony, rotting alive, must have seemed like justice to those who had suffered under his rule. Yet even among those with no love for William, there was horror at his fate. Medieval society had strong ideas about proper treatment of the dead. Even an enemy should be buried with dignity. That William, a crowned king, had been treated so poorly would have disturbed people across the social spectrum. It suggested a breakdown of proper order, a failure of fundamental civilized behavior. The story served a social function, becoming a teaching tale about pride, mortality, and limits of worldly power. Parents told it to children. Priests used it in sermons. Nobles repeated it as a reminder to themselves. The grotesque details ensured it would be remembered. The moral lessons meant it would be repeated. In an oral culture where stories carried important social information, William's rotting death became a significant narrative. Chroniclers recorded the events in detail because they recognized the story's significance. They weren't merely being sensationalist. They were documenting what they saw as an important historical and moral event. Their detailed accounts ensure that we, nearly 1,000 years later, can understand what happened with remarkable clarity. The story continues to resonate through history. It has been retold in countless histories, referenced in literature, and serves as one of the most memorable deaths in royal history. Few can match the combination of drawn-out suffering, degradation, and grotesque finale that characterized William's end. It has become inseparable from his legend, mentioned almost as often as his victories. Modern retellings almost always include his death in detail. Biographers struggle with how to present it, balancing historical accuracy with readability. Documentaries linger on the details, recognizing that audiences are both horrified and fascinated. The death has in some ways overshadowed other aspects of his reign. People who know little else about William the Conqueror often know he died rotting, and that his body exploded at his funeral. This fascination speaks to something fundamental about human psychology. We are drawn to horror, especially horror that befalls the powerful. There's something compelling about the mighty being brought low in such dramatic and disgusting fashion. It satisfies something in us, perhaps a desire for justice, perhaps simply morbid curiosity. Medical details understood through modern knowledge add another layer of horror. Knowing what was happening inside William's body, understanding the bacterial processes, makes the story even more disturbing. We can comprehend the slow tissue death, the spreading infection, the building gases in ways medieval people couldn't. This knowledge makes it no less terrible, only more precisely terrible. The death of William the Conqueror stands as one of history's most horrifying royal deaths. It wasn't a clean death in battle, which might have been celebrated as heroic. It wasn't peaceful passing in old age, which would have been dignified. Instead, it was slow, agonizing rot, watched by all, accompanied by abandonment and theft, culminating in a grotesque burial that shocked witnesses. Every aspect seemed designed to strip away the glory of his life. The man who conquered England, who defeated Harold at Hastings, who subdued rebellions and built an empire, was in the end conquered by something invisible and inevitable. The flesh that carried him through battles failed him. The body that had been his instrument of will became his prison and torture. William the Conqueror, who had bent so much to his will, couldn't control his own decay. His death serves as reminder that no matter how great our achievements, how much power we accumulate, we cannot escape our fundamental biological nature. We are mortal, vulnerable, subject to the same processes of disease and decay as anyone. Thrones and crowns provide no immunity to peritonitis. Victories in battle mean nothing to gangrene. Power cannot prevent rot. The theft of possessions, abandonment by servants, chaotic funeral, all underscore another truth. Worldly relationships are often transactional and temporary. Those who serve the powerful do so because of that power. When the power fades, so does the loyalty. William's wealth couldn't buy devotion from people who would rather flee than endure the smell of his dying body. His authority meant nothing when he could no longer enforce it. Yet there's something profoundly human in his story. The confessions, attempts at reconciliation with his children, seeking spiritual comfort, show a man confronting mortality and trying to find meaning and redemption. Beneath the crown and reputation for brutality was a human being who feared death and hoped for salvation. His suffering, while extreme, was fundamentally human suffering. The horror of William's death is multi-layered. Its medical horror, the reality of rotting alive. Its social horror, the abandonment and theft. Its existential horror, the stripping away of dignity and power. And its human horror, the confrontation with mortality and helplessness. All these layers combined create a story that has resonated across centuries, horrifying and fascinating in equal measure. 938 years later, we still tell the story of how William the Conqueror died. We still recoil at the details, still feel something of the shock witnesses must have experienced. The story survives because it touches on fundamental truths about power, mortality, and human nature. It reminds us that beneath all our achievements and status, we are fragile creatures of flesh and blood, subject to forces we cannot fully control. William the Conqueror reshaped England and changed the course of history. The Domesday Book, the castles, the Norman aristocracy, the changes to the English language, all these legacies endure. But alongside these monuments to his power, stands the story of his death, a monument to his mortality. History remembers both the conqueror and the conquered, the powerful king, and the helpless victim of his own rotting flesh. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it's important that we remember not just what William achieved, but how he ended. Rotting alive in a monastery, abandoned and betrayed, his body bursting at his funeral. This is the full measure of the man, both his triumphs and his degradation, both his power and his vulnerability. The reign of William the Conqueror transformed medieval Europe, but his death transformed our understanding of power and mortality. He conquered kingdoms but was conquered by bacteria. He inspired fear, but ended by inspiring revulsion. He accumulated wealth but died robbed. He commanded loyalty but was abandoned. He sought dignity but found degradation. In every way his death was the opposite of his life, and that contrast is what makes his story so powerful and so disturbing. The conqueror, in the end, was conquered by the one enemy no one can defeat: death itself, made all the more terrible by arriving slowly, painfully, and publicly, reducing a king to a rotting corpse that couldn't even be buried without causing horror. This is the legacy of William's death, a legacy as enduring as any of his